All right, if you're watching this, that means you are in the process of putting together the journal article. That's the one that where you're collecting data in your own classroom. So what's going to follow here is just a bunch of sort of steps to get you from right now, when you have a lit review, when you're doing work in your classroom, to December 5th, when the first draft is due. All right, really quickly, this comes from the pop essay assignment. You can see in the right-hand column. This is the format, the sort of the structure of the essay you're going to write. These are the pieces. So you can see that there's an introduction in which you'll sort of set the context and sort of lay out your problem. You'll include your revised research review, and I'll get to that in a bit. There'll be a section where you describe what you've done and what you learned, and then the implication section will be really a discussion around what do you do with those findings. All right, so let me just sort of walk you through what's left to do. I'm going to just go each of these steps with a focus on the third step in particular. Now, you're working on collecting data, maybe you're doing testing, maybe you're having some engagements with students or interviewing them. You want to get done by Wednesday, November 30th. That will give you several days to look at the data and do an initial rough draft of it, but plan for about a week after Thanksgiving. All right, the key thing is going to be getting organized in order to write this paper. So many of you actually have ambitious plans to collect data or are collecting data. I want to make it easy for you to do so. So let me just sort of give you some tips about how to do that. The first thing I would do is I would group your data. And what I mean by that is create a folder in your Dropbox, your Google Drive, or whatever it is you're using to store this, and either store your data by the type, so like as in like interviews or tests, and or store it by student. So if you have, some of you have, say, a half a dozen students participating, create a folder for each and include all of their data. You can do both even. But depending on the way in which you think you're probably going to look at the data, I would organize and group the data that way. The other piece I would do is I'd create a table or a spreadsheet that's going to contain all the data you want to compare. In other words, you kind of want to create a master document that's going to allow you to look across student, look across test, however it is you're going to, whatever it is you're looking at, that allows you to do that really easily. And that's the point of creating a table or a spreadsheet. Google Docs is really good for this. A Google Sheets form might be really helpful to you, particularly if you did testing. And you're going to submit this to me. So just to give you some really basic examples of what that could look like, you can see here up top, this is just a really basic table in which the number of students are listed in rows, or each student's, like, you can put their names in there, right? And then all I've done here is, if you're, some of you are doing a pre and a post test, right, and doing interim formative assessments, etc. All I've done here is I've listed their scores, and what that's going to allow you to do in this situation is to read horizontally and see how each student did over time. It'll also allow you to read vertically as well and do something like creating a mean score, for instance, right? And you can see I did the same thing with what we would call qualitative data. Qualitative, by that I mean non-numerical data. That would be like words that people say, like a response to a question. So you can see here what I've done is I've grouped the students and then organized their responses by interview question. That would allow me as the analyzer to look across to see how the students responded, individual students responded over time, but most importantly, would allow me to look across students and make comparisons. This would allow you to do things like identify some patterns and things that they said so that you can start drawing conclusions from that. So this is going to sound familiar to you because in my feedback to your data design, I talked to many of you about thinking about this. And it's not a requirement. I just think it's the easiest way to go about putting together what is essentially the findings section. So if you look back again at the components, you can see it's the findings where you discuss the results. But if you look also at the rubric for this, you're going to see that it's important to me that you're both able to report on what happened and then also be able to understand the underlying causes or principles at work here. So that's essentially what we're doing here. What I'm suggesting is if you're just thinking about organizing the findings section, I'm really sort of thinking about two subsections or however you want to think about the sequence, right? One is a question about what happened. What did you find out, essentially? And then the second piece is really the deeper analytical question is how or why did it happen? What explains the findings? Those are your two questions that you're essentially trying to answer. They look a little bit different based on your topic and your data collection, but at the root, the gist, that's what you're doing. So let me try to explain both. So on what happened, you're really going to focus on the data set as a whole. It says across students and or across, sorry, that's wrong. It should say across students and or across like your data collection. So that could be things like across tests. It could be across different types of data like interviews versus test, for instance. This is where you're going to want to make calculations, right? Like doing a mean score, for instance, or grouping students, or determining what was the average growth over time, or determining patterns that you might see in like an interview in the whole set. And what you're going to want to do here is you want to draw and test overall conclusions. You really want to, this is the highest level. You're trying to say, this is what took place as far as I can tell, right? So those are questions like, did student learning or achievement change? To what extent, right? What do we know about what happened, right? What is the relationship between my use of an instructional strategy like prompts or STEMs and students, whatever it is they were expected to do. So that's the whole level. You're going to look at all the data that you have, and you're going to look more broadly. It's less a question about looking really specifically and deeply than so much as looking across students and across data type to see what emerges. And the second piece is you're going to look much more at descriptive detail. That's what I would use to say, like, this is where you want to really understand more about what took place rather than what the outcome was. In other words, we're really focused on process, like in the learning process, when kids were in discussion, for instance, right? When kids were using visual cues to spell words, what was happening, right? Because that's going to help us understand what effect our teaching practices or our changes had. So I want to reiterate to some of you, it does not have to involve all of your data. In fact, in many cases, you may want to zoom in on a particular piece because that you might find that what we would say illuminates the whole. In other words, you're looking for something that's representative, an individual that's representative of the whole. And really what you're doing here is you're going to draw and test causal relationships, right? So you're really interested in if you utilized visual cues, what happened, right? Not just in like the overall test scores, but like what did students do differently? What did they do the same, etc. And that's when you're going to want to look very specifically either at particular students, particular events, etc. So let me tell you a few methods that are used in research that can do this, right? One is what I call a case study, and I recommended to some of you to do this. In a case study, all I'm saying is that rather than look at every single student who you might have gotten data from, pick a couple of students and look very closely at them. And in this case, you're going to discuss very specifically how they did, what they said, what they know, whatever it is you know about them, including their background, and whatever you observe them do in the classroom. But you're going to focus in on that. And you want to pick cases, right? It's a case of something when you say that, right? It's supposed to be representative of the whole issue. So you want to pick something that's emblematic of the conclusions you've drawn, the questions you might have, etc. A critical incident's like a case study, but instead of focusing on a person, you're going to focus on a specific event or a situation that happened while you were teaching, for instance, or whatever it is you were observing. In this case, you're just going to really zoom in on like a meaningful situation that helps, again, represents what took place. So you're not covering every single piece. So if you're looking at the way in which how students took up feedback, you might want to focus in on a couple of situations in which feedback was provided and then what the student or students did afterwards. And then finally, what I mean by qualitative analysis is that is you just look very specifically at a kind of data, a kind of document, for instance, and use that as a way in which to sort of draw conclusions. So you might have collected students' written work, for instance, and you might focus, do a analysis of specifically how much students wrote or the kinds of things that they said in a very particular assignment. Again, zooming in on one piece to describe the whole thing. why I want to pause right here and just note something that I think is really important, particularly the what happened. It is entirely okay if you do not show amazing results. In fact, if you don't show any results or they're like negative, that's okay. The goal here isn't to prove to me or to yourself that you were effective. The goal here is to learn. So I just want to make sure that like in your findings section in particular, if the kids show no results or the results are inconclusive or the data is problematic, say that. It's good to say that. It's really important to say that. Don't feel like you have to say something positive simply for my sake. I'm interested in seeing what you learned and that the conclusions that you drew were valid given what you did. All right. Last thing is, after you've done the data analysis, then is the time really to return to the research review. And I want to sort of give you an organization that works best for the final report because you can't just copy and paste in your previous work. You need to do some adaptation. So the way I would suggest doing it is this. I would think about it as sort of two pieces to the research part. One is I'd organize the research that supports the sort of the general approach. If you're thinking about your pop topic, so general approach to what you're doing, right? So what you want to, here is where you want to offer a rationale about why your pop topic is critical. So if you're talking about expression and fluency, here's where you note the research that supports instruction on expression, right? Here's where the research says that these are like generally the things that one does when teaching expression that's effective, right? So bigger picture at the sort of the topic level and the instructional level without necessarily zooming in at specifically what you've done in your data collection. It's in the next set of paragraphs that you're going to do that. The second piece is going to be look at and describe the research that supports the specific approach you're taking. So if for expression you're working with reader's theater, for instance, I should see literature that supports the use of reader's theater. In other words, you're offering a rationale for what you've decided to do in your classroom. And I want to see that in there. I want to make sure that the connections are drawn, that you made research-based decisions that are supported and have been shown elsewhere to have to be at least have potential. And I think it's in the second area that I've given a lot of you guidance and push to go back in and look more carefully at that piece. And I think you can't do enough to really look at other literature that might help or assist you in doing so. And again, if you're having issues finding stuff, come check with me. Happy to help you with the search as well. And with any of this, don't hesitate to reach out to me.